Picture the map of North America in your head. I want you to go all the way up to the top left corner, the late 19th century.
Right.
We are talking about the vast, totally frozen frontier of the territory of Alaska. You have 20,000 miles of coastline. It is rugged, dangerous, absolutely freezing.
Yeah.
And there is essentially zero government presence.
Not at all.
No police, no courts, no hospitals, just ice, ocean, and these whalers operating with total impunity.
It was the literal definition of a lawless frontier. I mean, once you crossed into the Arctic circles, civilization was just a rumor. The U.S. had purchased this massive landmass, but they had almost no way to actually govern it.
Except for one very specific exception. There was one man on one ship who basically was the government out there. He was the judge, the doctor, the policeman.
The Postal Service?
Yeah, the Postal Service, and the savior for an entire region. They called him Hell-Roaring Mike.
Captain Michael A. Healy, a massive legend in maritime history.
And today, we are going to unpack the story of Captain Healy for you. But this is not just some standard sea story about dodging icebergs. The more I looked at our source material, we're basing this deep dive on the Wikipedia biography of Michael A. Healy, the more I realized this is really a story about identity.
Oh, absolutely.
Because on the surface, he is this legendary, tough-as-nails sea captain. But underneath that, there is a secret that he kept hidden his entire career. A secret that, if it got out, would have ended absolutely everything for him.
That is the crux of it. We're looking at a man who was born into slavery in Georgia, yet he somehow managed to navigate the really rigid racial hierarchies of the 19th century to become the absolute authority in the American Arctic.
It's wild.
He is recognized now as the first African-American to command a U.S. government ship. But during his life, that part of his identity was a fiercely guarded secret.
It creates this incredible tension throughout his whole life. So for our mission today, we are going to explore how a man born enslaved becomes the king of the Arctic. And to understand that trajectory, we can't start out on a boat.
No, we have to start in Jones County, Georgia. It's 1839.
Deep south, plantation country. And the family dynamic here is, well, it reads almost like a Gothic novel. You have Michael Morris Healy, an Irish immigrant who becomes a really successful planter. He has about 1,500 acres. And then you have Mary Eliza Smith,
who was an enslaved woman of mixed race. And this is the crucial legal context we have to impart impartially based on the records. She was owned by Michael Morris Healy. She was his legal property.
Right. Which brings us to the partus principle mentioned in the source. This is the legal doctrine that defined the lives of so many people in this era.
Exactly. Partus, sequitur, ventrem. It basically means that which is brought forth follows the room. So the legal status of the child was determined entirely by the legal status of the mother. Even though their father was a wealthy, white Irish planter, Michael and his siblings were legally born as slaves.
Which is just a terrifying starting position in life. But the father, Michael Morris Healy, he does something that really deviates from the norm for a man who owned 49 slaves. He doesn't treat them as property. He acknowledges them as his children, and he really wants them educated.
Which was illegal in Georgia at the time. You could not educate enslaved children. But he has the means and he has the ambition, so he sends them north.
And this is where the story gets pretty staggering. We aren't just talking about Michael achieving success here. The source material outlines what they call the Healy Achievement across the entire family. These siblings didn't just survive being sent north, they reached the absolute pinnacle of their fields.
It really is a who's who of 19th century achievers. I mean, you have James Healy. He becomes the first U.S. Catholic African-American bishop, the Bishop of Portland, Maine.
A bishop in the 1800s. And then there's Patrick.
Yeah, Patrick Healy becomes the first African-American to earn a PhD, and he eventually becomes the president of Georgetown University.
That just blows my mind. The president of Georgetown was a man born into slavery, passing as white in the post-Civil War era. And you also have Eliza, who becomes a mother superior, an abbess.
It is an incredible family dynasty. But then...
And you have Michael.
Right. You have Michael, the black sheep of the family.
The total rebel.
He just didn't fit that scholarly, religious mold that his siblings did. He was sent to the Holy Cross school like his brothers, but he was completely unhappy. He was rebellious. They even shipped him off to a seminary in France at one point, and he just wasn't having it. Finally, in 1855, at age 15, he runs away.
He runs away to sea. It sounds exactly like a cliche from an old boy's adventure book, but he actually did it. He signed on as a cabin boy on the Clipper Jumna.
And that decision probably saved him from a life he was totally unsuited for. He spends the next decade really learning the ropes of the maritime world, working his way up on merchant vessels. He learned navigation, he learned leadership, and he learned how to survive in the absolute worst conditions.
So let's fast forward through the Civil War era. Healy is out at sea for a lot of it, but in 1864 he returns to Boston. And this is the major pivot point in the biography. He applies for a commission in the Revenue Cutter Service.
The Revenue Cutter Service, for context, is the direct predecessor to the modern Coast Guard. It was the armed maritime law enforcement service of the United States.
And here is a detail from the notes that really stuck with me. Michael Healy is accepted as a third lieutenant in March 1865. And the signature on his commission, it is Abraham Lincoln.
Signed just a month before Lincoln was assassinated. So on paper, Michael Healy becomes the first African-American commissioned officer in the service.
And we have to really lean into this for you to understand the stakes. The service didn't actually know that, did they?
No. The historical evidence strongly suggests they had absolutely no idea. This brings us to the reality of passing. Michael and his siblings identified publicly as white Irish Catholics.
Right.
They were of mixed ancestry, predominantly European in appearance, and when they moved north, they assimilated into the Irish community. The source explicitly notes his African-American ancestry was not generally known during his career.
We have to look at what's on the line here. This is not just about omitting a tiny detail on an application form. In 1865, under the racial laws of the time, if the Revenue Cutter Service discovered his mother was enslaved, he wouldn't just be denied a commission.
No.
He would likely be discharged, socially ostracized, or much worse.
Absolutely. His entire career, his command, his livelihood, it all rested on maintaining that secret. And you have to wonder how much that shaped the persona he later adopted, because when you are living with a secret that could destroy you, you often overcompensate.
That makes a lot of sense.
You become the most competent, the most undeniable person in the room so that no one even dares to question your background.
Right. If I'm the toughest, scariest, most effective captain in the entire fleet, nobody's going to go digging into my birth records in Jones County, Georgia.
Precisely. And history ended up handing him the perfect stage for that persona. 1867. The U.S. buys Alaska.
Seward's Folly. The giant icebox that everyone thought was a total waste of money.
Until they realized it was absolutely full of resources. But for the Revenue Cutter Service, it was a logistical nightmare. They had to patrol a coastline longer than the entire Atlantic seaboard, with almost no infrastructure. Healy heads west. He serves on the Reliance and the Active, and he learns the very specific skills needed for Arctic navigation.
And this is where he learns from the whaling masters, right?
Yes. While on the Active out of New Bedford, he studied the whaling fleets, he learned how they operated, where they went, the dangers they faced. That knowledge became his superpower when he returned to Alaska. He wasn't just a government man. He understood the commercial traffic he was supposed to be policing.
So let's talk about the hardware for a second. Because you can't be the king of the Arctic without a throne. He eventually takes command of the Corwin, and then the famous Bear. And the Bear was not just any ship.
No, the USRC Bear is legendary. You have to understand, in the late 19th century, this was the absolute apex of maritime technology for polar regions. It wasn't made of steel. Steel gets brittle in that kind of extreme cold, and it can shatter on impact with the ice.
Right. It cracks like glass.
Exactly. So the Bear had a hull made of 6-inch thick oak planks. It was reinforced with steel plating only at the bow. It was literally designed to ride up onto the ice and crush it with the ship's own weight. It was a proto-icebreaker.
It's basically a floating battering ram.
A battering ram that was also a home. For Healy to command this specific vessel meant he was commanding the single most capable asset the United States possessed in the Northern Hemisphere.
And he used it to become Hell-Roaring Mike. Let's unpack that nickname, because it wasn't just because he had a loud voice on deck.
It was the total package. He was an incredibly demanding commander. He expected absolute perfection from his crew. You have to remember, the Arctic is entirely unforgiving. A loose line, a slow response, a navigational error, people die.
Yeah.
So he was hard on his junior officers. The sources say most of them found him extremely difficult to deal with.
And the source is also pretty clear about his relationship with alcohol.
Yes. He had a very well-known reputation as a hard drinker. So hell-roaring really referred to his volume, his temper, his intensity, and his drinking.
But here is the paradox that makes him so fascinating. While his junior officers were terrified of him, the native Alaskans respected him immensely.
They called his ship Healy's Fire Canoe. He was the law, but he was a consistent law. He actually had a standing order for his crew regarding the native population. He said, never make a promise to a native you do not intend to keep to the letter.
That shows a level of integrity that was pretty rare for government officials dealing with indigenous populations in that era.
It really does. He viewed them as his responsibility. The revenue cutter service was the only federal presence up there. Healy enforced liquor laws. He protected seals and whales from poachers. He delivered the mail, brought medicine, and acted as a judge. If there was a crime committed in a remote village, Healy was the one who sailed in and held the trial.
But we can't sanitize him either. We talked about the drinking, but we also have to talk about the brutality. The source mentions the Estrella incident in 1889. This is where the hell-roaring persona gets pretty dark.
Right. There were actual charges of cruelty brought against Healy. It stemmed from an incident on a whaling ship called the Estrella. Basically, Healy had a seaman triced up.
For those of us who don't know 19th century maritime torture terms, what does triced up actually mean?
It is a severe form of punishment. You handcuff a person's hands behind their back, run a line through the handcuffs, and hoist them up until their toes are barely touching the deck.
Wow.
It's excruciating. It dislocates shoulders. It cuts off circulation.
It sounds medieval.
It was barbaric by modern standards, but Healy defended it vigorously. He argued that it was absolutely necessary to quell a mutiny. And again, we have to pull back and look at the map. They are thousands of miles from the nearest court or jail. If you lose control of a ship in the Arctic, the ice crushes you or you freeze to death.
So his argument was basically, I am the only thing standing between order and certain death.
Exactly. He viewed that tricing up as an existential necessity to keep the hierarchy intact. And I think this connects right back to his secret identity.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Think about it. If he allows a mutiny, if he shows weakness, if he loses control of the situation, he faces a court-martial. And in a court-martial, his entire background gets scrutinized. He couldn't afford to be anything less than absolute iron.
That adds such a heavy layer of psychological context to his actions. He eventually dodged those cruelty charges, largely because the commercial whaling captains backed him up. They knew exactly how hard the crews were to manage out there.
Yeah.
But he couldn't dodge the alcohol forever.
No, that was his personal demon. There was a specific incident involving a Captain Shepard. Shepard was the skipper of another cutter, the Rush. Healy paid a routine courtesy call to Shepard's ship, but he showed up completely intoxicated.
Which is a massive breach of naval etiquette.
It's humiliating. And it got worse because shortly after that incident, Shepard was actually promoted to chief of the Revenue Cutter Bureau.
Oh, no.
Yes. Essentially, the guy he embarrassed himself in front of became Healy's ultimate boss.
Talk about a nightmare scenario.
Shepard wrote him a formal letter basically saying, look, if you can't control the drinking, you are going to lose your command.
And this is where we see a real crack in the armor. How did hell-roaring Mike respond to that? Did he rage against it?
No, he didn't. He wrote an apology, and it is actually quite moving to read. He pledged, quote, never to touch intoxicants again. And his reason, he said, one thing I will hate, and that is to give up my command of the Bear. I love the ship.
I love the ship. That really humanizes him. It shows that the Bear wasn't just a job for him. It was his identity. It was the one place where he was the absolute master of his own destiny, completely regardless of his birth.
The Arctic was the one place where his merit and his skill mattered more than his history. And that brings us to the other side of his legacy, because we have talked about the strict discipline and the drinking, but we really have to talk about the humanitarian work. He wasn't just punishing sailors, he was engineering survival for thousands of people.
This is the part of the source material that surprised me the most, the Reindeer Project.
It is a fascinating piece of history. Healy had been observing the ecosystem collapse in the region. Commercial whalers were just decimating the whale and seal populations. He saw this happening firsthand on his patrols, but he also saw the human cost. The native Alaskans relied heavily on those animals for food. With the whales disappearing, entire coastal villages were facing starvation.
So he didn't just write a report about it to Washington. He came up with a massive logistical solution.
He looked right across the Bering Strait. He had been to Siberia on his patrols. He noticed that the Chukchi people over there had domesticated reindeer. They used them for food, for clothing, for milk, for travel. And he thought, why can't we do that in Alaska?
It sounds so simple on paper, but the logistics of that must have been a nightmare. You are talking about transporting live herds of semi-wild animals across the ocean on a wooden boat.
Exactly. He teamed up with Reverend Sheldon Jackson to make it happen. They had to sail to Siberia, negotiate with the Chukchi, load these terrified, kicking animals onto the bear, keep them alive during the rough crossing, offload them in Alaska, and then teach the local population how to actually herd them.
It is an incredible feat of agricultural transfer.
It was literal nation building. Over the course of a decade, they transported over 1,000 reindeer. It created a completely new food source and a new economy for the native Alaskans. It actively prevented a famine.
So you have this man who will hoist a sailor up by his handcuffs to stop a mutiny, but will also spend years carefully transporting reindeer to save a population he has absolutely no blood relation to.
That is the duality of Michael Healy. He was a savior and a terror all wrapped into one. He was also formally recognized by Congress in 1885, specifically for his life-saving work, rescuing whalers who got trapped in the crushing ice. He was constantly pulling people out of the jaws of death.
So how does the story end for the King of the Arctic?
It ends with the inevitable passage of time. He retired in 1903 at the mandatory age of 64.
Forced retirement. For a man who loved this ship more than anything, that must have felt like a death sentence in itself.
He really didn't last long on land. He died just a year later in 1904 in San Francisco. He had a heart attack, and he was buried in Colma, California.
And when they buried him, the world still viewed him as a white Irish-American captain.
Correct. His African-American ancestry was not generally known. It was a secret he successfully took to his grave. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians started to really dig into the Healy family history and realized, wait a minute, this legendary Arctic captain was part of this incredible mixed-race family from Georgia.
It's amazing how history can be rewritten, or at least clarified, so long after the fact. And now the Coast Guard has fully embraced his actual heritage, right?
Oh, absolutely. In 1999, they commissioned a massive research icebreaker and named it the USCGC Healy. It is one of the most advanced ships in the entire fleet. He is now officially and proudly celebrated as the first African-American to command a U.S. government ship.
I love that arc. From a runaway cabin boy hiding his identity to having a massive icebreaker named after him. But there's one final, incredibly ironic twist to his legacy that the Wikipedia source mentions. It brings us all the way back to Georgia.
Yes. The plantation. The exact land where he was born, where he was legally a slave, and where his mother was owned by his father.
What is that piece of land today?
It is called Healy Point, and it is the Healy Point Country Club.
A country club.
Yeah.
You really cannot make this stuff up. The site of his enslavement is now a golf course bearing his family's name.
History has a very strange, sometimes dark sense of humor.
It really does.
Yeah.
So let's wrap up this deep dive. We have Michael Healy. Born to an Irish father and an enslaved mother, he runs away from a life in the church, passes as white in a time when being black meant exclusion or worse, joins the revenue cutter service with a signature from Abraham Lincoln himself, and becomes the most feared and respected man in the American Arctic.
He protects the environment, saves the native population from starvation with the Reindeer Project, fights mutinies with brutal discipline, battles his own alcoholism, and leaves a legacy that is only fully understood 100 years after he dies.
It's just an incredible story of resilience and navigation. He navigated the ice, sure, but he also navigated the social traps of the 19th century with incredibly high stakes.
And it forces us to rethink what the frontier really looked like. It wasn't just this monolithic expansion. There were people of all backgrounds shaping the map of America, even if they had to hide who they were to do it.
That actually brings me to the big question I want to leave you, our listeners, with today. We know about Healy now, because historians did the difficult work to connect the dots. But it makes you wonder, how many other hell-roaring Mikes are there in the history books?
That is the real question.
How many other figures who completely shaped our world had secret identities or backgrounds or heritages that completely define their internal drive, yet remain totally hidden from us? Does the way a person identifies themselves in their own time matter more, or does the box history puts them in matter more?
It is definitely something to think about.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us into the frozen north.
Always a pleasure.
We will catch you on the next one. Stay curious.